Rod, on your own, obviously that's a vote. Okay.
Terms and conditions apply, committee.
Thank you, Rod. You've got a visual run-through bullet point that you want to make, and councillors will be aware of the recommendations on the paper and aware of the fact that at this point the location of the base has not gone back to Cabinet for final decision, so our decisions at this meeting reflect that fact, but also indicate a clear preference on the part of Council, given the information that we are about to receive from our officers. So, Rod, if I can ask you to walk us through your paper, please.
Thank you very much, Your Worship. Councillors, thank you for the opportunity to give a very brief introduction to this conversation, which I'm sure you'll all be approaching with great interest, as are we. If we could just start the slide presentation, we've got it here. So take you back 3 weeks to the governing body meeting of the 23rd, where it was agreed that while there was a preferred option called the Wynyard Basin option, it was agreed that there would be further investigation around an option that the Minister put forward, which suggested less incursion into the harbour and placing the bases primarily in 3 different locations on Wynyard Point. So since that time we have worked with officers at MB. There have been a number of site visits by the Minister so he could gain a better understanding of the issues. We have provided a significant body of information to the Minister, and we further developed that option which councillors saw on the 23rd to the next option. Fiona, if you could put that up. Thank you. And I just thought I'd just talk briefly about this because it is a subtle variation to the option that councillors saw on the 23rd. So this option looks at a small extension of Halsey Wharf of 15 metres. It still retains the 73-metre extension of Hobson Wharf, which was proposed in the solution that councillors preferred last meeting. But it reduces the number of base locations on Wynyard Point to just 1. So it's removed those bases which were proposed on the northwestern face or side of Wynyard Point. It's removed the bases off Site 18, and it's focused primarily on what we call the ASB car park, which is car parking for both ASB and Sanford, and the site immediately to the south of that, which is currently leased by Sail New Zealand for storage of their boats, and a double base right at the base of Wynyard Point. Now the primary risk with this option, as we've outlined in our paper to you, is around timeframes, and we'll talk very briefly about timeframes towards the end of the presentation, because timing really is the critical issue, and I can't stress enough that if we're going to deliver this event, we have very little time. We have to stick to the time frames. Secondly, cost uncertainty around this option, and while there is further investigation underway as we speak to look at how time frames and costs can be minimised, we still believe that there is so much uncertainty around cost that is a significant risk. We also believe that this option doesn't contribute as much in terms of legacy. That's how this investment will provide benefits for the future for Auckland. And most importantly, as far as Team New Zealand are concerned, we can only accommodate 7 bases on this. Their brief to us was for 8 bases, and all of the other options that we considered could provide those 8 bases. This can only provide 7. The other important consideration is here that particularly these double bases, which would be large teams that would have sponsorship and hospitality attached to them, they will want to have the opportunity to have the public down to the bases to partake of that hospitality, to buy the merchandise and be part of the activity. And that is going to be a problem, inviting the public down into this hazardous area. And we consider that another fatal flaw in this option. So if we go to our recommended option and again just summarise why we believe that if New Zealand is going to host the Cup, this is the only option that meets all of the criteria, most importantly around cost, timeframes, delivery certainty, and is fit for purpose. So there's three components here. We're looking at this location in three different lenses. The first is around delivery. Construction time of around 14 to 16 months. We know that there will be stakeholder opposition to the extension, the 74-metre extension, and it will displace existing tenants, but we do have a management plan around that. It requires dredging, as do all the options, to cater for these yachts with the very deep keels. In event mode, there would be good opportunity for public engagement along the Eastern Viaduct, Tawero Island, North Wharf, and the ability for the public to get out onto Halsey Wharf, onto Hobson Wharf, to look at these bases, be part of the activity, and as I said previously, to take part in the hospitality and the engagement that these teams and these bases will be offering. It's located within close proximity to the existing infrastructure, all of that hospitality, most importantly the space where we can have large groupings of people in a safe environment, so there's ways for these people to get to and from the event. There's the clustered benefits around the village model that we talked about. We can provide the provision for super yachts, fewer super yachts than the extended model that we talked about last time, but super yachts, the J-class fleet. However, as in the other options, we have to mitigate the effects of tide and wind so that we can create those sheltered water conditions, which is critical for the safe launching and retrieval and the placing of the rigs in the boat. In legacy mode, the wharf structures can be used for maritime water-based events, and that's always been a strong consideration from us, that we do leave a legacy for water-based events which are currently limited, so there's more greater opportunity for the public to enjoy getting out and onto the water and for those events to take place. In terms of what we've been doing over the last 3 weeks, there's been significant conversations with stakeholders, and we just wanted to give you a very quick update on where we're at with that. So between ourselves and central government, we have been in consultation and discussion with mana whenua and understanding their issues, and we understand that there's been significant gains and certainly a level of engagement at senior level within council and with central government, which is a significant move forward. In terms of government, we have been assisting with due diligence while they undertake their due diligence around the Wynyard Point option, and a lot of discussion around that and sharing of information, consultants and viewpoints. We've met with local boards and updated them on progress and outcomes. Obviously, there's an ongoing conversation with Team New Zealand around fit for purpose, what their requirements are, design options and operational issues. With the Royal New Zealand Yacht Squadron as the holder of the Cup, again around operational issues. With our tenants in Wynyard Quarter and getting an understanding of their concerns and how we could mitigate those. And key stakeholders. Now, there are a number of stakeholders who are directly impacted by this development, and we've had meetings with a number of them to, again, understand what their concerns are, and particularly the common theme is legacy and what this investment will produce for Auckland in the longer term. I mentioned earlier this is all around timing, and so I draw your attention to this program which we have up on the screen at the moment. So we're here in that circled area on the top line to make a decision around location, and I can't stress enough how critical getting a clear decision is so we can move on into the next important phase, which is lodging for a resource consent. And we've talked to you about how we propose doing that, lodging a consent through council, how it would then go through the one-step process through the Environment Court, a chance for public hearings and submissions, and then very much a decision one way or the other by the end of July, early August next year. During that stage, the consenting stage, we would be evaluating the procurement options and getting our building consent in line so we could start construction once we had a decision at the end of the consenting phase, starting construction around August of next year, so we could have the bases complete for the first teams arriving around summertime, and it could be as early as September 2019. So these dates, as I said back on the 23rd, cannot shift. We don't have the luxury of being able to push this out. We have to have the infrastructure ready by the time the teams arrive at the back end of 2019. There'll be pre-event trials and events running through 2020, culminating in the Christmas Regatta at the end of 2020, and then the event proper, the Prada Cup, the Challenger Series, and the America's Cup will take place early 2021. And 2021, as we've discussed, is going to be a very busy year, and we'll be all lined up. We'll be ready for a fantastic Auckland year of events. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rod. I will formally move the recommendations set out in the report.
Happy to second. I've got the report.
Seconder, Councillor Fletcher. We'll take first of all questions of Rod and Fiona, and then a broader discussion. So any councillor that has any questions. I know we've been through this before. I know the arguments have been set out very clearly in Rod's presentation, but this is the opportunity, if you do have any outstanding questions, to ask those. Councillor Watson.
Thanks very much. In the post 23rd of November option with respect of Wynyard Point, it only provides for 7 syndicate bases. What's the prospect of, if there is indeed 8, I think I remember asking the question at last time, if some of the other interested parties, a la the people up at Gulf Harbour, for instance, is that a realistic possibility that if there was a need for 1 additional or maybe a couple additional, that could be catered elsewhere?
Thank you. And through the chair, that question was posed to Team New Zealand, and I think Kevin Shoebridge's response at the last meeting is it would be up to the teams to negotiate locations if they weren't able to be accommodated in this current arrangement.
Okay, thanks. As far as the Wynyard Point option goes and potential, greater cost, you've mentioned certainly the greater uncertainty, but as to say just the cost component of it, has it been put to the government that that council would expect any additional cost, given our preference that's been indicated, to be picked up by government? Has that been put on the table to them in any shape or form?
The government is fully briefed in terms of the costs. In terms of cost sharing, I believe that's a conversation the Mayor's been having with the Minister.
I think the short answer is we're focusing first on location. Obviously, one of the factors we're looking at is is either of these options going to be at lesser cost to the ratepayer and to the taxpayer. I think that it's certainly not clear that the Wynyard Point variant would cost less. On paper, yes, but then there's a question of if you had to move the hazardous substances tanks, then the answer is that it would probably cost more. So one of the issues that will come up in discussion next week, I'm sure, will be okay, which of these options actually has a higher cost, but that will be only one factor in what we're looking at. I'm being careful what I say about costs because I don't want to paint the government into a corner. Obviously, what the Chief Executive and I would be looking for is the best possible deal for Auckland, but we are also aware that we've got to meet a fair share of the cost of infrastructure. I've also put it very clearly on the table that I'm not interested in making any contribution towards a host agreement. I don't think that's appropriate. I think we are making a big contribution in terms of infrastructure from which we'll draw a legacy, but a host agreement, that's something that we've never had to consider in the past, in 1999 or 2003. I don't believe it is appropriate.
Just for one final question as to the public access or the difficulty with the hazardous substances around Wynyard Point. Obviously, that's open to the public as it stands. You know, people can bike and walk and all the rest of it all around there. One would assume, given that it has that degree of accessibility now, that it wouldn't necessarily be a big ask to just make sure that people couldn't go into those places, or they were, you know, securely shut off from any public access. What's the real nature of the problem as far as keeping public where you want to in this particular location?
Well, let's just talk about how we manage that space currently. In general, everyday mode, then yes, you're right, the public are able to get down there, but we don't make it a big deal about encouraging people down there. In event mode, which we already hold, we manage how the public use that space very carefully, and we discourage actively people moving northwards of Jellicoe Street while we're having events in Silo Park and in Wynyard Quarter generally. So this would be no different. However, as I outlined in the proposal, the public will have a desire, and most importantly, the teams will want the public to be part of their story, to be able to enjoy the hospitality, be part of the sponsorship activities, the merchandising activities. And it's historically been a very important component, and it is very important to these teams that the public are engaged and able to come onto the bases. So we just believe that with the hazardous goods, with the risk, with having to shut down Brigham Street with only one access there are going to be some significant safety issues to have to be addressed, if even under operational mode, let alone having additional public down there.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Wayne Walker.
Sure. Through you, Mr. Chair, first of all, I just beg your assistance around questions. Quite obviously, this is the first time that I've seen this information. So while I'll have some questions now, as I digest this, I may have some questions later. So I just beg your cooperation around that. So just have a few questions. First off, the question goes to the resource consenting process.
Yes.
Given that we're in a situation where we do not know who the various syndicates are going to be, we don't know the quantity, nor do we know the scale, is it conceivable that the resource consenting process can be scenario-based? That is, we might have a scenario that allows for a slightly larger area. If there is a larger number of syndicates, or conceivably a fallback option if there is a small number. And could that scenario go to both the Wynyard Point option and the Wynyard Basin option?
Again, through the Chair, the recommended option provides the space for the maximum number of bases. We cannot get any more bases on that area. However, if there are fewer challenges, then obviously those can be accommodated within this scheme. We would be lodging a resource consent for this recommended option as it stands, a single consent.
Okay, so I'll ask the question again. So, is it possible to have a consenting process that allows for scenarios? So we might have a consent for Wynyard Point, and I'm referring to particularly the extension of Halsey, but a modification of that consent for a reduced extension of Halsey. Because we simply don't know. The last thing that we want to do is to have a consenting process, I'd suggest, that locks us into something that we don't need.
I think lodging a consent on the maximum scheme gives you the option to deliver less than that scheme is requesting. I think, well, technically, yes, you can lodge more than one consent. That is true, you can do that. However, given the timeframes we have, it makes sense to deploy our resources on one scheme, and we give this our best shot to deliver what we believe is the only scheme that's going to meet all of the criteria that have been agreed.
Okay, well, through you, Mr. Chair, I just want to lodge a concern here that we don't go over the top when we simply don't know. So I just want to register that concern.
I think
and if I can just speak to that,
that
would also go to
No, we're just
further
on questions at the moment, Councillor. I think the answer that you've got, if you just consider it for a moment, is you can always build less than what you've gone for consent for, but you can't build more than what you've received consent for.
Correct.
So the target is 8. If any beyond 8, they have to make their own arrangements. We have no obligation to any numbers beyond that. But obviously we have to consent for the expected number, because you can't retrospectively alter your consent to provide for more.
okay.
Do you have other questions?
Well, if I come back to this question around consenting, and that is around the merit of having a consent that goes to both the Wynyard Point option and the Wynyard Basin option. And I note that there are some things that are in common and some things that are not. For example, the Wynyard Point has some work in Wynyard Point that is different to the basin. So there are differences, sir.
Yep.
And my question is, can we put in a consenting process that covers both of those? And as far as the commissioners are concerned, and I'm assuming this is going to be heard by independent commissioners, offers different scenarios. That might also have the prospect of enhancing the consenting process, and certainly as far as the public of Auckland is concerned, may well have considerable merit. So that's my question. Can we do that?
It can be done, but I think it puts the process at considerable risk.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I would appreciate some delineation, some commentary on risk, because I would suggest that it might actually minimise risk. But again, I don't want to put the officer on the spot. We've had so little time to consider this, and arguably officers as well. So I'll move on to the next question. And the next question goes to the matter of costs and the relocation costs and aspects that go to legacy. When I look at the Wynyard Point option, and just the note at the base, relocation costs, 18 millions, marine users, car park relocation and build. When I compare that to the similar commentary in the Wynyard Basin, the relocation costs don't give me anything more than just the figure, so I have to try and imagine what is involved there. So I'd like some assistance in just what the relocation costs under Wynyard Basin are. So are they the same or different?
Councillor, in the report, there's a little table on page 13 which outlines the costs for both. The infrastructure delivery costs, the event costs, giving a total delivery and event costs. The relocation figure that you raise is the same for both options.
So that's page 13 of what?
Of the report that we got at 6:30 last night.
Okay, sorry.
I'm looking at my
yep.
page 13, item 10.
Sorry, I have a table on my page 13. Apparently, you guys have a different report. So, to answer your question, the relocation costs are the same on both options.
Find the location first, so we're on the same page?
Cost of delivery.
Which number?
48.
You're referring to these sheets
Yep.
here.
Okay.
Have councillors got those available to them?
Yes.
There are two spreadsheets, one for the Wynyard Basin
This morning.
and one for the Wynyard Point
I
option.
don't have those in an A3 format.
That one.
But at the bottom they've got the relocation costs, the delivery construction costs, and the event construction costs, Wayne. So if you can have a look at somebody else's sheet, that might.
I mean,
that
I
might
have
help.
that sheet.
Okay.
It doesn't give me any breakdown
No.
of relocation costs for Wynyard Basin. That's my question.
They didn't give us a magnifying
Yes.
glass, Your Worship.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
no. It has got the relocation costs for the Wynyard Basin. It's $16 to $18 million.
It doesn't give me a
And-
breakdown.
Well, we don't have all of the breakdown of it, but that is the relocation costs for Sea-Link and for the airplane. Rod, could you clarify
Yes,
that, please?
I'll repeat what we covered off in detail at the last governing body meeting on the 23rd. The relocation costs affect two tenants, the Sea-Link tenant and the seaplanes, and involve relocating them to the western side of Wynyard Point. It's the same cost for both options, and that's 16 to 18 million.
Okay.
But you've got the car park relocation for Wynyard Point, which
Wynyard
is
Point,
an
there's a
estimated
series of additional
51.
costs
Yeah.
around car parking, and that range of costs for the hazardous goods potential relocation, because they would have to suspend business during event operation.
Okay. So my question around this then is those relocation costs, marine users, but particularly the car park relocation, would you consider that as a legacy item? It's an enhancement? Is it bringing forward something that arguably needs to be done later anyway?
Not necessarily. This is a direct replacement, like for the parking that is required under current lease agreements.
Okay. I'd welcome the opportunity to explore this question a little later, Mr.
Okay. Thank you
Mr.
very
Mayor.
much, Councillor.
And I have one other question.
Another question?
And the other question is around risk as it applies to the Wynyard Point option and the Wynyard Basin option. And the risk goes to multiple things. It goes to resource consent, objections to the resource consent, issues around construction. I'm sure that there are multiple risk elements. What's the risk profile difference between Wynyard Point and Wynyard Basin, particularly as it goes to the extension of Halsey?
We don't believe there's any difference in risk between the two options of the Halsey component or the Hobson component. It's the Wynyard Point component when we start looking at negotiations with existing leaseholders, including the hazardous goods operators.
So if I can just ask a question further to that, Mr. Mayor. So do you consider that the risk attached to a 75-metre extension is identical to the risk for a 15-metre extension?
I consider it being less.
So 75 metres is less risk than 15?
No.
This is...
No, the risk of the two options, 75 metres versus the Wynyard Point component, I would consider that being of less risk than going out onto Wynyard Point, into that hazardous goods areas.
I'm thinking particularly in terms of the resource consent risk.
My
I
position
think
doesn't
that's
change.
what
Yeah.
Rod's answering, that the risk of trying to get consents in time, if it did require relocation of the hazardous substances and it would require the closure of the road, are greater in resource consent terms than the risk, which is still a real risk, about objection to the extension of Halsey Street Wharf. I think that's the answer.
Okay, so my last question is similar to a question that I asked last time that we had a meeting around this, and that is, have you had any preliminary discussions with the parties that have an interest in the Wynyard Point area? You know, that's the area that we're talking about on Wynyard Point, on Wynyard Point number 1 and number 13. So have we had any discussions with them?
Yes, we have.
And are you at liberty to discuss whether they're accommodating or not in terms of what we're proposing?
They're confirming the position that we are covering off in our report.
That's in the most recent report.
Correct.
So I haven't read that yet, so I'll try and get to that. Might come back to that later, Mr Mayor. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Councillor Chris Darby.
Thanks, Mayor. Just a little update. The Māori impact statement refers